On the scale of the last few centuries, of course, industry is one major game changer. But there are a couple of others that I think really have a huge impact on large-scale cooperation. One of them is the Enlightenment and the rise of republics, constitutional republics. And another one is post-World War globalism. So maybe if we can turn to constitutionalism a little bit. So rather than the old-fashioned loyalty to a king or the might makes right principles, we now have constitutions with fixed sets of rules and principles. I'm curious if we see any evidence that constitutional states are any more resilient to political stress than monarchies were.
Yeah, it's a good question. The problem is that because the modern democracies are so recent that they basically, they're 100 years old. If you look about, let's say, universal suffrage, right? Even in the UK, I think universal suffrage is like late 19th century or something like that. In Switzerland, before 1970, women couldn't vote. What is it? Why is this important? Because these secular cycles typically unfold over periods of a couple hundred years. So we have not given the modern democracies enough time to prove themselves, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And also just look at what's happening in the United States, where according to the Freedom House and some other organizations that rank democracies, the United States has lost a democratic index over the past since 2016. All right. It's it was good 10 years ago. You could say that there's no evidence that. But also, by the way, if you look back into the antebellum period in the United States, the United States was a reasonable republic. I mean, there was, it was not universal suffrage, but women didn't vote, for example. But it still was a fairly democratic society, and it did not prevent it from going into the bloody civil war, which was really a disaster. So I will just quote Zhou Enlai, who was, as you may know, the main Mao's comrade in arms when he was asked about what's the significance of the French Revolution. He thought about it and said, "It's too early to tell."
Very good. Let's also turn to post-World War globalism. And as the scale of cooperation grows, it's natural to ask whether it can ever culminate in global culture or government or world peace. Yet competition is globalizing as well. It seems since World War II, there seems to be a cognitive dissonance between de facto globalism and strongly emotional protectionism. Asabiya seems to be stalled at the level of nationalism. How do you explain the fear of globalism?
Well, I think let's turn it around a little bit, because I think that we as a humanity, one of the biggest questions that we have not solved yet is how to stop wars, and both wars like civil wars, but also interstate wars. And so I think that you've got to solve this problem, because sooner or later, if you don't, we'll self-immolate. So this is one of the greatest challenges that we face. Right now, my theory often is misunderstood, saying that war is important for cooperation. That's not true. What's true is that competition is important for cooperation. So, but nobody said that competition has to be violent, right? In fact, quite a lot of competition now between states happens because different states compete against each other in generating good quality of life for their citizens. You saw that very clearly during the Arab Spring, when people were going out in the streets and blaming their governments for mismanaging the countries because they had some, examples of countries which were not mismanaging them. So this kind of competition, economic competition, ideological competition, non-violent competition, that's very necessary. If you shut it down, what will happen is that all those units will lose internal cooperation, and so things will break apart, and that will actually lead eventually to wars of all against all, which is not a happy situation. So we need to figure out how to cooperate on the global scale. The only way I see of doing that is co-opting, as you said, co-opting our capacity for cooperation and playing it out at the global level, right? And so, so we have to imagine the human, the humanity, the Anthropocene, as an organism that needs to be functionally integrated. And the most important thing, there are really two existential problems that that you have to solve as a humanity. One of them is stopping wars, and the second one, of course, is preventing the planetary health from breaking down.
Right. Well, that leads into the question of competition. If we were to cooperate on a global scale, there would be like no them outside of us to compete against, or at least no human thems. I'm wondering if non-human antagonists like climate change or viruses could ever play the role of a common enemy that we worldwide could rally against. It seems to be very difficult to do that. We find it much easier to compete against other people than against natural forces. Yeah,
because we have evolved to be that way. But evolution is not destiny. So we understand that this is something that this has evolved, and so therefore we need to figure out how to use that to how to harness it in the good cause. Right. I don't have a specific specific things to suggest here. It's more of my hope that humans will be able to develop such institutions that would allow us to cooperate at the global level. And again, it would be very important to limit cooperation at the global level only to those things which represent existential dangers. And that will, because that's the way also how to connect capacity to cooperate to an existential threat.